I watched them toss the envelope into the reclaim bin. No signature, no caption, just 5 frames of what I saw with my own eyes. The system said they didn't exist. I took them anyway. Some things weren't meant to vanish that easily. By March of 1945, the Western Front had fragmented into a series of converging offensives. American forces had breached the Rhine. The British and Canadians pressed northward through the Netherlands and northern Germany. Pockets of German resistance still existed, but the industrial centres lay in ruin, and much of the infrastructure had collapsed. The Allied high commands, particularly Schaeff under Eisenhower, accelerated documentation efforts to record evidence of war crimes, logistical failures, and battlefield damage before chaos or Soviet control obscured the details. Official photographers, film crews, and intelligence teams moved rapidly behind advancing lines, instructed to capture everything of value: military, humanitarian, forensic. At an American mobile documentation center stationed just outside Bad Kreuznach, west of the Rhine, the US Army Signal Corps operated a forward photographic unit in support of the 12th Army Group. The team was tasked with cataloguing not only battlefield damage, but also the growing number of civilian testimonies from liberated labour camps and bombed-out towns. Negatives were developed on site, filed, and couriered back to centralised repositories in Paris and London for archiving. By this point in the war, standardised forms dictated metadata for each roll of film: date, location, photographer's name, unit, subject matter, and operational classification. Among the enlisted men assigned to this unit was technician 4th grade Karl Richter, a 28-year-old Signal Corps photographer originally trained in architectural survey work before the war. Drafted in 1942, Richter had spent most of his service documenting bridge damage, rail yards and fuel depots across North Africa and later France. His assignments were methodical. Most days involved long hours with a speed graphic camera, followed by evenings in the makeshift darkroom housed inside a converted truck. He was known among his team for his precision, not particularly social but reliable, punctual, and unusually strict about exposure calibration. Richter's work during the German retreat through the Rhine and remained largely procedural until April 3rd, when his unit received a couriered set of orders redirecting them to assist an investigative detachment from the US Third Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, near the town of Ohrdruf. The name meant little to most in the unit. The location had only been secured the previous day. Their briefing was brief: assist with documentation at a recently discovered compound believed to have been part of a larger forced labour camp system. The order included a classification code, SCA, indicating the subject matter was of both Signal Corps and Allied intelligence interest. Richter and 2 other photographers, one sergeant and another technician, arrived at the site mid-morning on April 5th, a day after General Patton had personally visited the scene and ordered senior staff to witness what had been uncovered. The compound, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, was littered with emaciated bodies, improvised mass graves, and hastily abandoned barracks. The structures were still smouldering in places. Soldiers on site spoke quietly, many visibly shaken. A mobile medical team was already triaging the few remaining survivors. CIC personnel, aided by the German-speaking interpreters, had begun interrogating local civilians and guards. Richter followed standard procedure: bracketed exposures of each scene, exterior shots of facilities, contextual views to establish scale. He worked silently, stopping occasionally to annotate his exposure logs. Over the course of 3 hours, he shot 47 frames, mostly on 4x5 sheet film, covering a range of subjects from partially buried corpses to a hastily documented ledger book discovered in one of the guard huts. It was unpleasant work, but not beyond expectation. The key difference, unspoken, was the level of detail. Officers on site repeatedly instructed the photographers to capture full bodies, facial detail, and wide angles that included American personnel for identification. This was to be evidence, not just documentation. Back at the mobile lab near Gotha, the negatives were developed under blackout conditions that night. Richter and his team sorted through contact sheets, verifying that exposures were clean and labeling each with the standard log form. It was during this step that a clerk from the processing section flagged an issue. A subset of negatives lacked accompanying metadata. Specifically, 5 frames shot by Richter had no subject identifiers. The images showed partially decomposed bodies in a trench behind the supply hut, an area not marked on the general layout diagrams being circulated. The omission was minor but procedural. Army Regulation 1073 required that all negatives sent for official archiving include precise location, unit witness, and context data. The absent fields triggered a routine flag. According to policy, such negatives were either to be held for clarification or, if deemed duplicative or unclear, discarded entirely. The non-commissioned officer supervising the darkroom that evening, Sergeant Ernest Tolliver, consulted the standing orders and marked the 5 frames "Omit from Reel." Richter returned from field duties the next morning to find the set flagged. He reviewed the frames on the lightbox, noting quietly that the trench itself had not been noted in the earlier layout surveys. The ground had collapsed slightly, perhaps from rushed burial, and he recalled stepping carefully around exposed limbs. But lacking precise coordinates or witness corroboration, the images held no standalone intelligence value. Tolliver followed routine. "We log the rest, these we strike." Striking, in Signal Corps parlance, did not necessarily mean destruction. Under wartime practices, struck negatives were either set aside for later clarification or discarded outright depending on workload and classification urgency. In this case, with courier runs scheduled every 48 hours and a backlog of over 200 frames awaiting shipment to the London Archive Centre, the decision defaulted to discard. The negatives were set aside in a disposal envelope marked for silver recovery, a common salvage process used to reclaim silver content from unusable or unfiled film stock. No one present objected. The photos were considered redundant, additional imagery of corpses already well documented. Richter made no protest. He noted the action in his personal notebook but did not flag the issue in his official report. The task at hand was to process and forward verifiable material. Unclassified or unsupported frames fell outside mission priority. But something in the sequence lingered with him. That particular trench, he realized, had not appeared in any of the overhead reconnaissance imagery, nor had it been mentioned in the CIC's initial perimeter diagram. It existed only in those 5 unfiled frames, now placed in a steel bin marked Chemical Reclaim. He paused, looking down at the envelope, then turned back to the enlarger station to resume work on the next batch of approved frames. Within a week of the Signal Corps detachment's return to their mobile lab near Bad Kreuznach, the incident with the discarded negatives was largely forgotten, absorbed into the churn of documentation requests arriving daily from multiple commands. The growing volume of Allied operations across central Germany had created a backlog of photographic and film materials needing urgent processing. As American forces liberated one town after another, reports of additional forced labour sites and abandoned administrative centres emerged with increasing regularity. The photographers and clerks worked in rotating shifts, their tasks increasingly repetitive: shoot, develop, file, ship. Yet beneath the surface of this efficient machinery, tensions were beginning to emerge. The war was entering its final phase, but the sheer scope of destruction, along with the unfiltered nature of the evidence being captured, placed strain on the institutional boundaries that defined useful versus unusable documentation. The issue was not isolated to Richter's incident. Other field teams began reporting similar ambiguities. In early April, a Signal Corps unit operating near Nordhausen submitted an urgent field packet containing 86 photographs from a Dora Mittelbau subcamp. Among them were 5 blurred negatives showing collapsed tunnel shafts, presumably used for V-2 rocket production, and indistinct human remains. These images lacked exposure logs. The classification officer at the rear documentation depot, under pressure to clear space for higher priority film, filed the packet but listed the unclear images as omitted due to technical redundancy. A separate case arose near the city of Kassel, where a film reel showing local civilian cooperation with SS units was reportedly held for content review, never to reappear in the Signal Corps archive manifest. The formal explanation cited compromised narrative cohesion. By April 10th, Richter's unit received a set of amended classification protocols from the Chief Signal Officer's office in Paris. These instructions, distributed as Circular No. 1B7, reminded all photography teams to adhere strictly to filing guidelines. Specifically, the circular reinforced that any image lacking complete metadata would be considered non-operational and should not be sent forward unless exceptional justification could be provided in writing by a commissioned officer. The tone was bureaucratic, not punitive, but the implications were clear. The system would not slow down for incomplete evidence, no matter how visually compelling. In practice, this meant that field photographers like Richter were forced to make judgment calls in increasingly ambiguous conditions. A survivor's makeshift grave, an anonymous execution site in a forest clearing, a burned warehouse with no identifying documents. These were now high-frequency occurrences, but unless precisely logged, they risked being deemed irrelevant under the strict evidentiary standards being maintained for long-term archival and potential use in future tribunals. Meanwhile, pressure mounted to finalise and standardise the photographic documentation for what was now being referred to within internal memos as war crimes material. A liaison team from the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, operating out of London, began coordinating with Signal Corps units to identify imagery suitable for public dissemination once the war ended. The criteria were tightly controlled. The images had to be clearly legible, contextually established, and ideally include identifiable US personnel for authenticity. Richter noticed a quiet shift in tone among some of his colleagues. Those who had once treated photography as an evidentiary duty now began to exhibit signs of emotional detachment, even weariness. Some avoided certain scenes entirely, relying on broad landscapes rather than close-ups. Others began developing only what they knew would pass classification. There was little discussion. The system rewarded consistency, not moral inquiry. By mid-April, Richter had resumed routine operations, rotating between depots in Gotha, Weimar and Fulda. His assigned task was to photograph rail infrastructure damage and evidence of German demolitions intended to slow the Allied advance. But on April 18th, while stationed near Gardelegen, he encountered an American infantry platoon that had overrun a makeshift barn structure. Inside were over 100 charred bodies, forced labourers reportedly locked inside by retreating SS personnel and set ablaze. The stench, according to soldiers on site, was still overpowering. A chaplain walked among the bodies in silence. One lieutenant, visibly shaken, asked for photographic coverage to be done quickly. "We just need to get there down," he said. Richter documented the scene carefully. Exteriors first, then interior wide shots, then details of scorched remnants, boot soles, remnants of ID tags. He did not ask for a perimeter map. He did not wait for a CIC officer to validate the site. He developed the negatives that evening, in a repurposed farmhouse, using blackout cloth and well water. The exposures were clean, grim, but precise. When filing the documentation the next day, he followed the new Circular No. 137 procedure. But 5 of his frames, again the most disturbing, lacked verifiable metadata. The coordinates had not been confirmed. No officer had signed the site report. A Signal Corps classification clerk, new to the unit and unfamiliar with the emotional context, flagged the images and began drafting a disposal tag. Unverifiable, she noted. Potential duplication. Richter intervened this time. He requested the negatives be held for review, not destroyed. The request was met with hesitation, but allowed under a clause for pending field verification. The negatives were moved to a temporary drawer labelled with his name and left unsigned. Over the following days, Richter noticed an increase in such pending envelopes across the depot, not just his own work, but others. Photos with incomplete identifiers, rejected field reports, unclear sumptuary contexts. They were not being filed, nor were they destroyed immediately. They were simply accumulating in a sort of procedural limbo. One evening during inventory, he saw a junior clerk set aside 3 more envelopes into the discard bin without review. "No tags," she said. "Not our call." The bin was filling faster than it was being emptied. The system, in its efficiency, was beginning to erase itself, frame by frame, envelope by envelope, not through censorship but through routine. The evidence was not hidden by malice, but by compliance. By the final week of April 1945, the war's terminal velocity had overtaken every Allied department not directly tied to combat. Administrative decisions, once processed through layered chains of command, now travelled by courier in hours or were issued by field officers with only provisional oversight. In theory, this enabled quicker action. In practice, it blurred distinctions between protocol and discretion, especially within units handling documentation. Karl Richter's daily environment, his darkroom, his labelled contact sheets, his exposure logs, remained intact, yet the framework around them grew increasingly unstable. Entire towns were now bypassed or secured without full inspection. Some labour camps were documented thoroughly, others were merely noted in field reports and left for Soviet units approaching from the east. Even within the US Army, divergent priorities shaped what was photographed, how it was filed, and which negatives reached official repositories. The temporary drawer marked pending field verification had become, by late April, a fixture in the mobile lab near Fulda. It now held nearly a dozen manila envelopes, each containing exposed negatives lacking complete metadata. These images were neither destroyed nor catalogued. They existed in suspension, too disturbing to ignore, too irregular to file. On April 26th, a memorandum from the Office of the Chief Signal Officer in Paris reached the unit. The memo cited archival duplication, quality control, and legal admissibility as reasons to implement a new triage standard. Going forward, unfiled negatives older than 7 days were to be removed from circulation and transferred to a recovery facility for silver reclamation. This process, designed originally for damaged or failed film, was now being repurposed for backlog disposal. Richter read the memo without comment, but that evening, after his rotation, he returned to the drawer. He retrieved one of the envelopes, his own, from Gardlagan, and placed it flat on the table. He studied each of the 5 images by hand. Uncaptioned, yes, but unmistakable. A pile of partially burned corpses, a collapsed support beam across human remains, the blurred edge of a US duffel bag just outside the barn door. There were identifiers if one looked closely enough, but the memo did not allow for interpretation. It required documentation. He wrote nothing in the official log that night. Instead, he repacked the envelope and slipped it inside his duffel bag, an unapproved act, but not yet classified as a violation. The envelope was unfiled, unlisted, and formally marked for disposal. In theory, it no longer existed. 2 days later, at a fuel depot west of Kassel, a senior logistics officer attached to SHAFE requested expedited photographic review of a rail junction destroyed by German retreat demolition teams. Richter was reassigned to cover the site. It was a routine task, completed within hours, but while filing the contact prints back at the lab, he overheard a technician from another Signal Corps detachment complain about a similar issue. Footage of a destroyed civilian convoy near Halberstadt had been flagged and pulled from circulation due to lack of confirming ground testimony. The technician, frustrated, noted that the film had shown nothing ambiguous: charred civilian wagons, dead livestock, empty cribs tossed roadside. But no signed field report meant the reel was marked for omission. Richter asked quietly, "Where was it sent?" "Reclaim," the technician replied. "Same as the rest." That night, Richter took a second envelope from the drawer, this one not his own. He recognized the initials on the label: T5J Mahoney, another quiet photographer known for framing more than was required. The envelope's contents showed the aftermath of a forced labour column caught between retreating German troops and advancing American armour. Dozens of bodies lay across a wooded clearing. Some held tools, others blank ration slips with Wehrmacht stamps. But again, no coordinates, no officer witness, no formal narrative. He placed the envelope beside his own. By the end of April, the war in Europe had less than 10 days left. On May the 1st, as word of Hitler's death spread through the Allied lines, celebrations erupted in cities like Paris and London. But inside the mobile lab near Fulda, silence prevailed. The routine continued. Develop, print, log, file. The backlogs remained, and the drawer of pending envelopes sat untouched by command. Richter made a quiet decision. He approached Sergeant Tolliver, who still supervised the darkroom. "Some of these unfiled negatives," Richter said, "we don't have backup for. If they're destroyed, they're gone. We may want to retain a few for secondary review." Tolliver didn't look up from his logbook. "That's not our call anymore. Protocol says we recover silver from non-compliant stock. That includes yours. There's still room for provisional retention. Memo said 7 days. Some of these haven't reached that." Tolliver exhaled. "You want to start cataloguing the drawer yourself? Full metadata and witness narratives?" "If I can." A pause. "You're not going to get citations for doing this," Tolliver said. "You're not going to save a war." "I'm not trying to." After a long silence, Tolliver pushed the drawer across the table. 3 days, he said. Then they go. Richter began working off-shift hours. He reviewed each unfiled set, cross-referencing troop movements, locating officer names in field rosters, comparing terrain markers with topographic maps. He was methodical. When an image lacked explicit detail, he matched uniforms, insignia, and known unit positions. He added annotations in pencil on the contact sheets, not official logs, but enough to frame a plausible record. By May 5th, he had reclassified 4 envelopes as field verified. He submitted them for formal filing. 2 were accepted. The rest were returned as insufficiently corroborated. The drawer still held others, but time had run out. On May 7th, the German High Command signed the unconditional surrender at Reims. The war in Europe was over. Official orders redirected Signal Corps units toward post-war documentation and occupation duties. The mobile lab near Fulda received word to consolidate remaining film stock and prepare for redeployment. The following morning, as the darkroom staff packed crates for transfer, the silver recovery bin was opened. 2 junior clerks began emptying unfiled envelopes, most unlabeled, some water-stained, into the canisters for chemical processing. Richter did not intervene. He had already done what he could. The surrender of Germany on May 8, 1945, formalized what had already taken shape on the ground, a fractured and chaotic post-war landscape in which American units transitioned from combat operations to administrative control. Signal Corps units too shifted roles, no longer racing to document battlefield damage. They were now tasked with supporting occupation logistics, broadcasting psychological operations, and assisting in the preparation of war crimes evidence for military tribunals. In this changed environment, the urgency that once surrounded photographic documentation began to fade into a more bureaucratic rhythm. The mobile lab where Karl Richter had worked was decommissioned in June. Its remaining staff and equipment were absorbed into a larger processing centre set up in Wiesbaden, which would serve as a central hub for film, audio, and photographic materials gathered across the European theatre of operations. Materials deemed archival were to be sent onward to London or Washington. Materials without classification or clear chain of custody were left behind or quietly destroyed. Richter was retained on temporary duty at Wiesbaden, assigned to assist in cataloguing backlog crates. These included hundreds of rolls of microfilm, 16mm training footage, and thousands of photographic negatives from depots across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The job was repetitive. Open crate matchlog, confirm classification code, enter archive manifest, and assign retention status. Occasionally he encountered names he recognized: Mahoney, Tolliver, others who had passed through the same war-worn cycle of exposure, filing, and omission. It was during this slow drift into administrative closure that Richter stumbled across a misfiled envelope. It bore no classification code, no transit number, and no catalogue entry. Inside were 7 negatives, all intact. He recognized them immediately, the Gardeligan images, the same ones he had retrieved from the pending drawer and marked for clarification. The envelope should have been destroyed weeks ago. Somehow it had slipped through. There was no space for emotion. Instead, Richter noted the oversight in his personal ledger and quietly placed the envelope into a separate box, labelled Pending Re-Review. There was no formal channel for such a designation, but in practice many technicians created similar placeholders. He added a short annotation on the back of the contact sheet, previously marked for discard. Contains unverifiable but non-redundant evidence. Suggests secondary examination. The box was placed on a shelf for internal review. Whether it would ever be examined, no one could say. That same week, representatives from the US Army Judge Advocate General's Corps arrived in Wiesbaden to begin assembling materials for use in the upcoming International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. They reviewed only those records that had been formally classified, signed and logged by unit commanders or intelligence officers. Visuals lacking documentation were excluded without comment. The standard was clear: admissibility required provenance. On June 17th, during an internal inspection, the Signal Corps depot was ordered to conduct a sweep of all unclassified or unlisted material. A summary memo from the regional archivist instructed that photographic holdings not scheduled for formal transfer by July 1st shall be destroyed in accordance with War Department Protocol AR 3825. The directive triggered an internal wave of activity. Staff worked overtime to sort, tag, and process the lingering detritus of wartime documentation: partial negatives, undeveloped reels, mislabeled contact sheets. Some attempted to salvage what they could. Others, overwhelmed, simply followed the protocol. The silver reclamation bins filled again. One morning, a civilian typist assigned to assist the photographic staff quietly asked Richter why so many images, many depicting obvious crimes, lacked the minimum paperwork required to preserve them. He answered factually, because no one wrote the caption, no one signed the sheet, no one had the time. She stared at the bin of envelopes. Then they're just gone. He didn't reply. Shortly after, Richter submitted his request for early discharge under the Army's points-based demobilization system. His service record, clean and unremarkable, made approval a formality. His final day came in early July. He left behind no formal complaint, no record of objection, and no annotated dossier. Only a small handwritten note tucked inside a blank file folder left in his former workstation drawer. 7 frames, no caption, not unclear, just too late. The Signal Corps would never formally acknowledge the quantity of photographic evidence lost through process rather than policy. No list was kept of discarded images, no inventory of omissions was compiled. Once a negative was destroyed, it vanished without record. Only the successfully filed images, those that met the paperwork threshold, would enter the official archive. These would become the visual history of the war. In the autumn of 1945, as the Nuremberg trials opened, and Allied prosecutors presented their curated exhibits of Nazi crimes, the photographs selected appeared on screens before the judges. They were sharp, labelled, and methodically captioned. Each carried a file number. Each came with a witness statement or official sign-off. And each had passed through the invisible sieve of wartime protocol. Carl Richter watched a newsreel of the trial months later from a theatre in Baltimore. He recognized 2 images as his own. Others he did not recognize, not because he hadn't seen similar scenes, but because he had. Dozens of them. Images unfiled, metadata incomplete. Tossed into a bin on a quiet morning. Their absence wasn't visible. It simply wasn't noticed. By late in 1946, much of the US Army's photographic and intelligence material from the European theatre had either been transferred to permanent storage or quietly eliminated. Of the tens of thousands of photographs taken by Signal Corps personnel between 1944 and 1945, only a portion were retained from official archives. Those that lacked documentation, subject identifiers, location data, field witness corroboration, were deemed unfit for long-term retention. The policy was never secret, but neither was it advertised. What disappeared, disappeared by procedure. The remaining photographs, those that survived both battlefield chaos and post-war classification, became the basis for countless books, documentaries, tribunal records, and museum exhibits. They formed the public record, their captions were precise, their provenance certified, but behind that curated record stood a shadow archive, images never filed, never reviewed, and never mentioned again. Carl Richter never returned to photography after his discharge. He declined job offers from wire agencies and local papers in Maryland. Instead, he resumed architectural drafting work in Baltimore. He seldom spoke of the war, and never of the photographs he had taken. In the years following the conflict, he kept a small box of field notebooks and a few personal contact prints, none of which bore official classification stamps. When asked, he would say only that some things got lost through the cracks. In 1954, he mailed a package to the US Army Pictorial Center in New York. Inside was a brown envelope containing 5 contact sheets, copies of frames he had preserved from the Gardelegen site. There was no cover letter, just a single typed label. Material unfiled due to procedural omission, submitted for historical reference, not accreditation. The Pictorial Center acknowledged receipt. The envelope was catalogued as part of a miscellaneous accessions folder, alongside other anonymous or unattributed wartime materials. It was not rejected, but it was never integrated into the primary archive. By the 1970s, its contents had been quietly absorbed into a general research collection used by graduate students, curators, and archivists. Its origin remained unverified. The images, though real, lacked provenance. Without a witness report or unit classification form, they remained illustrative, not evidentiary. By the time Richter died in 1983, his name had never appeared in the official record of Allied documentation efforts. No citation listed him among the contributing photographers to war crimes exhibits or tribunal materials. No caption bore his initials, and yet decades later, one of his unfiled photographs, unlabelled, unattributed, would appear in a museum exhibit on lesser-known atrocity sites. The caption read simply, "Believed to be Gardelegen, April 1945, Source unknown. Image previously unverified. There was no further annotation, no scandal, no lost cache of photographs suddenly discovered. Just a fragment that survived, not through conspiracy or concealment, but because one man took the time to hold on to what protocol had abandoned. Not all the evidence vanishes in darkness. Some of it disappears by daylight. Through drawers left unfiled, bins labelled reclaim, and envelopes that miss their signature by a single hour, and some of it remains, quiet, unclaimed, but not forgotten.